Hello, everyone. Welcome to another virtual event with Mysterious Galaxy. I am Nick, the Director of Events for the store, as well as the digital marketer. Today, we are celebrating the week release for Reluctant Immortals. Look at this cover. And of course, we have, to celebrate this, the author herself, Gwendolyn Kiste. Hello, Gwendolyn.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
And in conversation, we have A.C Wise. Hi, A.C.
Hello.
Gwendolyn is the Bram Stoker Award-winning author of numerous titles, such as The Rust Maidens and Her Smile Will Untether the Universe, and of course the just-released Reluctant Immortals. Her short fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Nightmare Magazine, Tor's Nightfire, Black Static, and others. In conversation, we have A.C. Wise, the author of the novel Hooked, and Wendy Darling. Her most recent collection is The Ghost Sequences. Her work has won the Sunburst Award for Excellence in Canadian Literature of the Fantastic, and has been a finalist for Nebula, Stoker, Locus, Sunburst, Aurora, and Lambda Awards. Wow. I would love to welcome it. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. If you haven't gotten your own copy of A Reluctant Immortals or any other of Gwendolyn's books or AC's books, what are you doing? Click a link below. They'll take you to our website where you can purchase their books. Not only, by the way, has Gwendolyn offered signed book plates. I'll let that focus there. But AC has also, I got to show that off. You get a little doodle with ACs. And they all are different. There's a skull on one of them. There's a bow on this one. I love the skull one.
Oh my gosh. Like I feel like we were saying before this, I'm like, I've got to up my game. I've got to like do more doodles online.
And I'm just saying how bad my art is. So, don't think you're getting anything too special.
The moment you offer doodles, I swear, people at events or if you do like personalized stuff, they're like, oh yeah, okay, I got a doodle for you. So be careful what you wish for. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Your support helps us do these virtual events with wonderful authors that we would normally be in contact with because they're either outside of the country or are far part of the country that we normally wouldn't get to. If you want to submit, it looks like one person has already submitted a question. Good job. If you have any questions you want to submit for later in the program, there's a link below that says ask a question, and you can go ahead and submit them there, and they'll be asked later. I think I've done enough of talking. I'm going to leave this to Gwendolyn and AC to go ahead and continue with, but I'll see you all at the end. Be back later.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and welcome, everybody. I guess to kick things off, Gwendolyn, would you like to introduce your book and talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Reluctant Immortals just came out yesterday. So this is all very new. It's like a newborn book. And yeah, so it is the story of two forgotten women of Gothic literature, Lucy Westenra from Dracula and Bertha Antoinetta Mason from Jane Eyre. And they are the reluctant immortals of the title. They're living in 1960s California, trying to hide out from the past, but the past is close behind as Dracula and Edward Rochester make a very sudden reappearance in their lives.
I love how you're sort of reclaiming and reimagining the lives of these Gothic heroines. So I guess my first question for you is how you picked these specific characters, because I know you've written about Lucy before as well, so it feels like you maybe have an affinity for her. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of Lucy. I've loved her character ever since I first learned about Dracula as a kid. And, I was always so sad that, I love Mina, too. Mina is wonderful as well. And she makes a bit of an appearance in Reluctant Immortals, too. Little spoiler. But, I love her character as well. But I always felt like, she got a lot more attention in all the adaptations and in the book. And I always wanted to know more about Lucy. And it was just, she was a character that I always felt like didn't get enough attention, and I was always so interested in her. She just seemed like so much fun. Like she seemed like somebody who would be really fun to hang out with. She's a very loyal friend. She just seems like a really cool person. And I'm like, I want to know more about this character. And so it really, started with the short story I wrote that appeared in Nightmare, The 8 People Who Murdered Me, excerpt from Lucy Westenra's diary. And it was just Lucy talking about, her death and everything about becoming a vampire and really from her point of view. And when I finished the story, I was like, I really want to write more. Like, I want to hang out with Lucy some more. And, I thought right away about how much, another character from, that kind of Victorian literature was Bertha from Jane Eyre. And I was like, I've always wanted to know more about her as well. So I'm like, all right, let's put them together. Let's make them friends. Let's see, what they have to say when they get together.
And it works so well. And then you actually had a great essay about it that came out, I think, today, or maybe it came out yesterday.
In LitHub, yeah, that one came out today. Yep.
Yeah. So folks should definitely go check out that essay in LitHub, kind of talking about, Gothic heroines and specifically Lucy and Bertha and sort of the way they've been treated, and the way Gothic heroines in general kind of tend to get treated as, punishment for not fitting a societal norms. So I kind of love the way they're reclaiming their story here. And I feel like that goes a little, and maybe, well, I guess I can ask rather than assuming why you decided to move them forward to the Summer of Love in San Francisco, why that setting in particular. I have, some theories, but I'd rather hear directly from you.
See, now I'd rather hear your theories, but we can talk about that. So
All right.
For me, I really felt like I've always loved the 1960s, and I feel it was such a tumultuous time. It was also a moment of a lot of social change. And for these characters, they've been stagnating for so long. When we get into the book, they've been in this pattern over and over again of just barely getting by. And I thought it would be really interesting to put them in a moment in time when there was so much change, and they sort of get carried along with it in some ways. And that's what helps to change them and sort of get them out of this pattern of stagnation and really help them, find themselves. It was such a time of people looking for freedom and trying to figure out who they were. And that's always just been so appealing to me. And it just seemed like such a great place to put these characters.
That actually kind of goes along with my theory. So like, yay, I feel validated. Yeah, I was kind of thinking about how it's like, a time of societal upheaval and people really were pushing back against norms. And
Yes.
that's very much, sort of what Bertha and Lucy are doing, and kind of saying, like, this is who we are. We're not going to apologize for it. And we're not going to be, put in somebody else's box definition of what we're supposed to be. And we're not going to sort of apologize for our behavior and be, pushed to the side anymore. So that's really, really great. Yeah. So the book also deals with a lot of like really interesting ways of looking at monstrousness and sort of different characters' reactions to monstrousness. As you mentioned, Dracula and Rochester show up, unexpectedly, kind of trying to force themselves back into Lucy and Bertha's lives. And they both seem to be characters who are very much embracing their monstrousness and, not really at all interested in toning that down in any way, shape, or form. Whereas, B, or Bertha or B, is, kind of constantly fighting against it. Lucy as well. They're the reluctant immortals of the title, sort of kind of, they don't want to be monsters. They don't want to hurt people. And I thought, there was a very interesting contrast in their characters and the way they deal with monstrousness. And then you also have a character named Michael, who's kind of had monstrousness thrust upon him by his experiences at war. And you have really interesting parallels between him and Lucy, who have kind of both had this monstrousness thrust upon them, and kind of, the way they view themselves because of the experiences they've been through. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of that theme of monstrousness and kind of how it helped you sort of view the different characters and how they kind of all, come together through this lens of looking at various ideas of monstrousness.
Absolutely. I love that because, I feel like monstrousness is something that's kind of universal in some ways. Like nobody is perfect, right? We all have things within ourselves, these kind of darkness and things that maybe, aren't our best side, let's say. We may not be monsters in the way Dracula is a monster, but I feel like everybody has things about themselves that they're like, oh, that's maybe not the best side of me, right? And I feel like it is interesting when you see, in real life, not necessarily in the supernatural, of some people really embrace it and lean on it and like that's what they want to do. But other people are like, no, I really want to not be the worst thing that I can be. And so for me, kind of heightening that and putting that in a supernatural setting with vampires and with people who are mortal, and really looking at that and saying, where are you going to end up with Lucy and B? Because that's like you mentioned, that's the name Bertha goes by, is B. And they really don't want to be what they've been told they have to be. They don't want to have to be like the men that stole their stories. They're really trying to figure out a way to be able to be who they are and not have to be that monster. But at the same time, there is the world that is constantly trying to come in and trying to force, certain narratives on you. And you bring up the character of Michael, who is has just come back from Vietnam in the story and kind of gets carried along with Lucy and Bee as the story progresses. And, all of the damage that, war does to people and the things that we do to each other that aren't supernatural, and wanting to like make those parallels, because it's like, there are things that happen to all of us, and there are things that hurt all of us, and really looking at that and saying, how can you rise above that? How can you try to make a better world for other people so maybe they don't ever have to go through it? And really grappling with that and trying to figure out, how do we do that? How do we make a better world? And that's kind of what Lucy and Bee are trying to figure out, the whole book. At first the book starts, they're very much hiding, and they think that's what's going to be best, like not even letting the world see who they are and not even going out into the world that's hurt them. But as it goes along, they kind of have to. There's not a story if they just stay in the house the whole time. I mean, I don't know. We've always lived in the castle is mostly about them staying in the house. So I suppose that's certainly one approach. But for these characters, they do get out into the world, and they do end up, having to figure out how to balance that. How do you balance that monstrousness and still be out in the world and be with other people? And how can we hopefully make a better world for ourselves and for others?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's like you say, you can't control everything that happens to you, but you can control how you react to it. And that's very much, what these characters are doing, kind of reclaiming their experiences and saying, okay, this is not going to define all of me. I still have some control over, what I put back into the world, no matter what I've experienced. Yeah. And you did touch on this a little bit with, wanting to explore the trauma of war. And I was wondering if, that was sort of the plan from the beginning, or if that's sort of something that evolved organically as you were working through the novel, which I guess is maybe my sneaky way of asking, are you a plotter or a pantser? Did Michael kind of evolve as a character of like, oh, I can make these interesting parallels? Or did you sort of sit down with the idea of like, these are kind of two, experiences that I want to explore and how they would intersect?
I knew if I was going to write something in the late 60s, you had to bring in the Vietnam War in some way, even though, you look at some of the history of the Summer of Love, and some people were there very much to protest and very much were against the war. But then some people who went to San Francisco for the Summer of Love just wanted to go and find out what it was about, or just go and have fun. So that was an interesting thing as I was researching, to realize that there was a lot of different people, like people pulling in very different directions as to why they were even there. So I suppose I could have written it and not done very much with Vietnam, but for me, I feel like this was about, talking about social change, and that was such a huge part when you think of the late 60s, even into the early 70s. The war was very much part of, the landscape of America. And so I was thinking about, like, I hadn't seen a lot done with Vietnam and vampires, and it seems like a strange combination. But then I thought, if I'm going to write this vampire story in the late 1960s, I need to deal with that. And then starting to think that, especially for Lucy, in my version of her, she isn't this murderer like Dracula has been. She's been able to learn how to, as we said, try to pull back that monstrousness as much as she can. And so at one point, and this is fairly early on, she talks about how Michael, the one who just came back from Vietnam, has actually seen more death than she has as a vampire, and how much that actually, really kind of freaks her out. This thought of like, even though she is dead, and even though she's seen some death, like, because of what's been done to him, having to go again, be drafted was something that like put him in a position to know death even more than she does. And so that to me was like really jarring and kind of like frightening to think of that as like, the things we do that aren't supernatural can be worse than even the supernatural. So that was definitely a parallel I did want to draw and at least deal with to some extent, and try to grapple with what that means to people.
And I think that's always sort of what the best speculative fiction does, is kind of gives you, a lens or a mirror to look at, the mundane world, as it were, and kind of get a new perspective. And I just really appreciated the way you did kind of do that parallel and that mirroring. And, like you said, I've never seen kind of anybody look at Vietnam through the lens of vampires or monsters in that way. And it was really effectively done. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about one of your other books. So this is not the first time you've kind of taken characters that existed in other settings and reimagined them. You also did this in All the Pretty Marys, which is a novella that looks at sort of Marys from nursery rhymes and urban legends like Bloody Mary and Mary Quite Contrary. So I was wondering sort of what draws you to the idea of retelling and reimagining characters, and also are there sort of any other characters or classic stories that you could foresee yourself taking on in the future for a reimagining or a retelling?
Yeah, so I love reimagining so much. And I know that you do too. Wendy, Darling, and Hooked are amazing. And so I just think it's so much fun to be able to take a character that people already know. And so like you don't necessarily have to do as much exposition, but then you can really get into the heart of the story right away. But then when you look at it from a different perspective, it's these archetypes and these tropes that we go to. And I think a lot about fairy tales and how so many fairy tales have been reimagined. And I love the work of Angela Carter. I think she was so great at reimagining fairy tales. And I remember the first time I ever read one of her stories, The Company of Wolves, I was just stunned that this existed in the world, that, somebody had taken Little Red Riding Hood and done something so different with it. And I just remember so vividly, like the literature class in college where I read it for the first time and was like, this is so cool. And I couldn't get it out of my head. And I feel like, once I really committed to writing fiction, it was like, I know I want to do things like this because it affected me so much. And it's so wonderful to have something that's so familiar and yet unfamiliar at the same time, especially in horror and dark fantasy, because it kind of, it lulls you into thinking, oh, I know this story. I'm familiar with it. And then it does, what horror does. And it like subverts that. And it kind of like is unnerving to have stories and characters that that suddenly aren't quite like what you know. And that, I think that's such a fun experience as a reader and then also as a storyteller. As for what I would like to reimagine next, is definitely the picture of Dorian Gray, which I had initially planned to incorporate into Reluctant Immortals. And my editor very wisely said, if you want to do that, you can do that, but it's going to need to be a much longer book. And I knew I really wanted it to be about the length that it was. I really love about 80,000 word horror stories. I think that horror novels work really well right around that length. Those are the ones I've always really liked, or about the length that Reluctant Immortals is. And I was like, yeah, I don't really want it to be longer. And I knew that Lucy and Bertha, those were the two that I was really committed to. And because it was going to be Sybil Vane, Dorian Gray's first girlfriend in the story. But that being said, I at least want to write like a novella or a novelette, if not a novel, with Dorian Gray and Sybil Vane, because it's like, I think that's really interesting. Because like, he's another guy that I'm like, Dorian, you're not a very nice guy.
Yeah. Well, I would love to see your take on that, so please do. So as mentioned in the intro, you also have a one. Oh, sorry about the dogs. Okay, she's quiet for now. Hopefully that nope. All right, I'm gonna try to. Hold on just a second.
The dog just wants to be part of the event.
There. Okay. Maybe now if they're both on the other side of a closed door, I think they're sort of barking at each other through the door. And letting them both be in the same place will make them a little calmer or not, but at least there's a door in between us and them now. So as I was saying, The Rust Maidens is another wonderful novel that you have that kind of explores female friendship and sort of the violence done to women and kind of how they cope with that. And it seems to be, kind of a theme that recurs in various ways. You touch on that in Pretty Marys, obviously in Reluctant Immortals, and it's, sort of either, the monstrousness of like, or the violence done by an actual monster, or the violence done by the environment, and kind of, how women frequently seem to be the receiving end of it, but how, they refuse to let that define them completely. So I was wondering sort of, what is it that sort of draws you to that theme, and specifically the way you kind of tackled it in Rust Maidens, which I thought was really, really interesting, because it is a lot about sort of the environment, kind of changing these girls and, you know, what they do with that.
Yeah, so with the Rust Maidens, it's for anyone who doesn't know, it is about these 5 girls who start changing. It's set in alternating timelines between 1980 and 2008, but the bulk with the Rust Maidens is in 1980 as these girls are graduating high school and they start turning into the rot and rust of the Rust Belt, in particular in that era. And, you know, it is a lot about kind of like the hopelessness. They didn't really have a lot of options. And so it's just, they sort of start becoming like the environment that they're from, that they kind of can't escape. And I love body horror, you know, and there is some body horror in Reluctant Immortals as well, with both the way that both Lucy and Bee are immortal, because I think so much of, you know, the horror that we can experience is, you know, through our bodies. And yeah, it is definitely a theme I keep coming back to. And like you said, with the way that women are treated and the way that women often aren't given a lot of choice over many different things. I mean, obviously, we're thinking a lot about that this summer and the choices we've lost. But even before that, you know, the Rust Maidens is several years old now. And it's just, there's not a lot of options or as many options, you know, and really kind of pushing back against that. And a lot of times my characters are trying to find a way to have some control over their lives. And, you know, in the Rust Maidens, it's like, you know, they start kind of trying to figure out, do the girls want to change? Or is this just something that's happening to them? How much of this is like maybe the choice that they're making to try to escape? And that's kind of throughout the novel of like, how much is this something that, you know, is happening to them, or how much of it is this is at least a choice they can make for themselves? And so that is definitely something I think about a lot in my work. And, you know, what are the choices we can make? What choices do we have? And, you know, how can we push back against people who want to take that away from us and take those abilities to decide what's best for ourselves?
Yeah, and I love the way you've sort of explored it in so many different ways through your different novels of, again, you know, you can't control everything, but you can control how you react to it. You can control how you define yourself. You can't control how other people define you, but it's sort of, you know, what you do with that. And you do always a wonderful job with that. And another thing I think that you always really do a wonderful job with is giving a really deep sense of place in your novels. So I was curious a little bit about, you know, sort of the kinds of research and preparation you do for writing a novel. Do you go to visit the places that your novels are set, or do you sort of do more, you know, from a distance research, looking at images and kind of immersing yourself that way?
It tends to be more from a distance. And it's interesting. We just talked about the Rust Maidens. I haven't been back to Cleveland in probably 5 years. I'm actually planning to go back to Cleveland in the next couple months, and it'll be the first time I've been in the area. I went to college there. And so I spent a tremendous amount of time as an undergrad there, but I haven't been back for a number of years. And so, and the same thing with Reluctant Immortals. It's set in both Los Angeles and San Francisco. I've been to both cities, but it's been years. So a lot of times I actually, you know, when I was writing the Rust Maidens, I could have driven to Cleveland because it was only a few hours away. Whereas with Reluctant Immortals, I wrote that during the pandemic, and I'm in Pennsylvania, and I was not going to obviously take a plane ride to somewhere in the middle of the pandemic. So one of the ways I think about it is I almost like it to feel a little bit dreamlike. And so in that regard, it's like if I'm pulling from my memory, it's going to almost have that kind of gauzy feel to it, that it does feel a little bit more ethereal and a little bit more dreamlike. And I actually kind of like that, because I think a lot of times, I've already talked about fairy tales, I think a lot of times about my work almost like fairy tales, and whatever I'm writing is kind of its own sort of fairy tale. And they kind of work in that way that's almost got this kind of mythic quality, or it's very ethereal with a sense of place. And so that's definitely something that I think about, like, in wanting it to have that quality of like memory. But at the same time, I do love looking at, like, you know, videos and pictures. I love, you know, with Reluctant Immortals, I ordered a lot of different books that were, you know, from the Haight-Ashbury district in that period of time, or people who were just in Los Angeles at that time, or I was just talking again today about there's an amusement park in the book that's only in like one chapter called Playland at the Beach that was actually starting in the process of closing down just a few years after in the early 1970s. I got like a lot of pictures of that. So I do like to have at least that to draw from, even if I'm not physically there, because pictures are almost like memories too, right? In their own way, pictures are like a form of memory. And so really drawing from those elements when I'm writing something and wanting to get as much concrete as possible, but while still having that kind of, almost dreamlike quality, and trying to balance that so that it feels like you can really root down as a reader, but that it still has this kind of, dreamy quality to it.
Yeah, and I think you actually have a short story set in Playland as well that came out recently too, and that also has that very sort of dreamlike quality. And a lot of the story kind of is about memory and sort of like moving through the various sort of iterations of this place as it's closing down. So
yes, yeah, I love
that was an inspiring location.
Yeah, honestly, and I have one more story I want to write there that I like started, and I'm like, it's not quite done, but it's going to be. I feel like with Reluctant Immortals, that's I think called Things to Do in Playland When You're Dead, and then this will be this third, and it'll be like the trilogy of Playland at the Beach, this old San Francisco amusement park that I got super obsessed with during the pandemic, which is kind of a funny thing to get obsessed with during a pandemic when you're like stuck at home, and I'm like, oh, an amusement park is
I think lots of people
being trapped at home right now, so maybe that has something to do with it too.
There's just something like very evocative about, amusement parks, and especially sort of like older ones, and the idea of one like as it's shutting down and sort of all the memories there. It seems like a perfect, setting for speculative fiction, or maybe like Ray Bradbury got into all of our heads. And
exactly. I was just talking about that to someone. I was like, it's Ray Bradbury. I grew up with Bradbury. Both my parents are Bradbury fans, and it's like he just knew how to like bring like these creepy little amusement parks. And it's like obviously Something Wicked This Way Comes, but he did it in even some of his short stories, and they're just like so cool, and I just love them. So yeah.
I feel like he's responsible for just like an entire generation kind of being obsessed with amusement parks and writing, like, American Horror Story Freak Show is probably can trace its roots back to him, and Carnival and all those things. It's like he ruined or improved an entire generation, and we thank him for it.
I love it. It's so true.
We're getting close to like the half-hour mark, so I am going to ask, because I see we have at least one question from the audience. So I will pop over and whoosh. Sorry. All right. So what limitations do you feel, if any, when writing other writers' well-known characters?
Oh, okay. Yeah, absolutely. Anytime you're going with public domain characters, going into it that, not everybody's going to like what you're going to write. So you have to kind of think like, okay, everybody's got their idea of who Dracula is. I mean, that's like a great example, because obviously that's in this story, but also there's so many versions of Dracula. And I feel like you talk to people and people are like, Bela Lugosi or Gary Oldman or Christopher Lee or someone else that I'm not even naming, maybe Max Schreck from Nosferatu, I don't know. But like everybody has their idea of who Dracula is. And so anytime you're writing a character that's very well known, there is always that kind of feeling of like, some people aren't going to like it. Some people might like it. I'm a big fan of seeing a lot of different, iterations of public domain characters, because I always say this. I love the public domain. I love the idea that things go into public domain. Like, I hope one day my stuff will go into public domain and people will actually still care, and they'll be like, I'm going to rewrite, I don't know, the Rust Maidens. Like, go for it. Like, that's the coolest thing in my mind. So I also go into it from that perspective of how reverent I am to the public domain, and the idea that we can all kind of like play with these characters and explore them, and it's like our own mythology. And I just find that to just be so much fun. So whenever I'm doing, I'm always like, how can I give reverence to it and at the same time do something different with it, and kind of, balancing those two things of being like, obviously I love both Jane Eyre and Dracula. I wouldn't spend this much time, writing an entire novel about them if I didn't love them. So, trying to have that reverence while also being like, let's do something different, let's have fun.
I mean, that's kind of like the joy of art, that it can be in conversation, and it's not taking anything away from the original, it's adding to it, and
Yeah.
putting your own interpretation out there. And if people don't like it, well, they can go back to the original, and then maybe this will be the gateway back to the original for other people too. So it's kind of a constant cycle of conversation between works, which I think is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Looks like we have some more audience questions. Oops. There we go. Sorry, I'm still trying to like figure this this whatever platform we're on now, and have completely blanked out on the name of the software. But anyways, the question: were there any scenes or research that ended up getting cut that you wish had made it to the book?
Ooh. It's funny. I just remembered this last night during my book launch. There was a scene that did get cut. And it was the section in general was taking too long. I 100% agreed with my editor, but it was the only thing that I was sad that got lost was I really did want to integrate the music of the 1960s into the story as much as I could without it just being like, distracting. I didn't want it to get distracting. But at one point early on in the first draft, Lucy was just basically cruising around at night in, Los Angeles throughout Hollywood. And I was really careful about what day each of it was, because like certain things happen at certain times in the novel. They have like the summer solstice. So I knew I had to have everything, planned out. And it was a Friday night. And I learned that in Los Angeles on that Friday night in 1967 was the swan song for this really cool rock station. And I was able to find the entire like bootleg tapes of this last night on this rock station with them, like, saying goodbye and like giving all this narration for like the Doors and Jefferson Airplane and all this stuff. And I actually integrated it as the story went, like as the scene went along. And it was like very much kind of like doing this great foreshadowing to a lot of the things that happen later on. And I love radio and I love music, and I was so excited, but then the scene was taking way too long. So that did get cut out, but like, it's like a deleted scene someday. Like maybe I can like have it somewhere. Cause that was a really neat part. A lot of that section overall did take way too long. And sometimes what do they say? Kill your darlings. That was a darling. It probably needed to be killed, but it is like one of the scenes that I'm like, would have loved that. Cause it was like, it was exact. I was able to be like, this was the song that would have been playing at this time. And then this one, it was just like a really neat thing that it was so cool that you can find things like that on the internet. Like, 55-year-old bootlegs from a radio station last night. Like that's like something that I feel like 30 years ago would have been very hard to find, but now you can just look on the internet. It's like, there.
You have to like know somebody who worked at the radio station or something like that. Now it's just like free access. I feel like instead of kill your darlings, it should be like carefully excise your darlings and then turn them into their own separate short story, or use them as the basis for something else, another project.
I like that. I agree. Maybe I can still integrate that somewhere else.
Yeah, I would like to read that story too. So, keep that one somewhere. All right. So we have another audience question. Do you keep a typical writing set? I can't talk, sorry. Do you keep a typical writing schedule? And if so, what does it comprise of?
I don't at all. I feel like I used to before the pandemic, because my husband works in the evening. So I would drop him off at work and I would go and write at coffee shop. So it was like every, 5 nights a week, I would be at a coffee shop, and it was like so many other people at the coffee shop that I used to write at. The main one I used to write at were like artists and writers. So it was like this really cool, like kind of place to go. And it was this really neat coffee shop, but like, then the pandemic happened. Now my husband works from home. And so it's like, now it's a little more of a free for all, because it's like, I still usually write at night. I do usually write every day, but I don't hold myself to either one. And so it's like, there's not as much of a schedule anymore. And I keep saying I need to get a little more of a schedule. I think it would make my life a little bit easier, but I feel like writers like to make our lives hard. I feel like that's a thing we do.
Yeah, and I feel like the pandemic just sort of like threw everything into chaos for everybody in general. And
it really did. It like scrambled everything.
Yeah. I feel like it's more important to like just find what's working for you now and stick with it.
Yeah, I like that.
So we have another audience question. Did you have to do research for the book's time period?
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I knew a decent bit about the time period, going into it. That was one of the reasons. I mean, I've always been fascinated by the 1960s. Again, I thought it was such a moment of social change. And I think it speaks a lot about America and, where we've come from, where we're going, hopefully, where we can get to some days. There was a lot of, hopes and dreams in that time period. And some of them have been realized and some of them haven't. And I think some of the ideas then were really great. And hopefully we can get there. Peace and love is a good thing. It really is. And, but I did want to get a lot of the specifics. So, I was talking about Playland at the beach, the amusement park. That was something I didn't know about going into it. I learned a lot about just the specifics of like Los Angeles, because the story starts in Los Angeles, then moves to San Francisco. And so being able to research both cities and how they were different and how they were similar at that time. There were similarities, but there were definitely a lot of differences. And Hollywood was in like a real state of decay, and like the Hollywood sign was literally falling down. It wasn't repaired till like 1978. And so it was like, that was really interesting to be able to have this very Gothic setting of something that like I always think of as how the Hollywood sign looks now. It looks so cool. It looks so pristine. And that was not what it looked like at the time. And there was some movie, I wish I could remember what, but like, it was like a very B movie that showed the Hollywood sign around that time and like the opening. It was just falling down. It looked so bad, but they like had gotten up there on like Mount Lee and were like filming it. And it's like flapping in the wind and like it's making all these like scary sounds. And I'm like, this is really like a horror movie. This is so great. So that was like just so exciting. I mean, the poor Hollywood sign, right? I think it was completely torn down and rebuilt. Like they couldn't even like fix it, I guess. Like it was in such a bad state. It's a brand new Hollywood sign now. But that was really interesting to learn about. So a lot of like the specifics like that I could then like integrate. It's like, wow, this is really Gothic. Like these were two really Gothic settings. Like even Haight-Ashbury, the reason so many young people were able to move in is because a lot of those buildings were in kind of a state of disrepair. So they weren't very expensive for kids to move into at the time. I always say it's like, San Francisco is like known as being one of the most expensive cities, to live in now. But back then, they could move in because it was like, even those buildings were in a state of disrepair. So it was very Gothic. It was a lot more Gothic than I was even expecting going into it. So I'm like, well, this will work. This will definitely work for what I'm doing.
It's so cool when the historical research actually supports kind of what you want to do with your novel, not like, oh no, now I have to throw out this whole thing because that doesn't, mesh at all with reality. Damn it.
Yeah, right. So it's like, well, this will work. But then I'm like, oh, poor San Francisco, poor LA, like poor Hollywood sign.
And it's funny because you always think of like the 60s, and maybe this is just sort of like what media has fed us, is this sort of like idyllic, dreamy, like everything's beautiful and perfect. And obviously it had to be all shiny and new, but that's not the case at all, which is very cool.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's so true. Like even like recently, my husband and I were watching a documentary on Woodstock, which is a couple years after the Summer of Love. But like, I didn't realize they like ran out of food. Like they didn't expect that many people to be there, and they only had like one food vendor. So what ended up happening, this documentary said, was everybody in the town nearby just started sending food down to these like kids, and like everybody was getting fed by like what people had in their pantry. And it was like, I think they even had to put it on a helicopter because like the roads were so backed up with people. They put like the food on a helicopter and brought it all in. It's like this, like you said, you think of it as being so, they're so idyllic and it's so nice. It's like literally they were just having to bring in a bunch of food for all these kids at Woodstock because there wasn't enough food. And it's like, wow, it's very different. It is much more Gothic and a little dire than you kind of think, but
it's like one step away from turning into a Lord of the Flies situation.
Yeah, it really was. And what was interesting about the documentary is I didn't realize quite how much it was, only because everybody worked together. Like there weren't like a bunch of fights that broke out. And then you kind of contrast that with those documentaries that just came out about Woodstock 99, where everybody did fight and set everything on fire. And I'm like, what does that say about the direction we've gone in the last 50 years?
Not good. We're in some ways we're progressing, in some ways it feels like we're just sort of sliding backwards.
Yes,
or,
exactly. It's a strange time. Yeah, it's a strange time to live in, because you're right. Like some ways it's like we're definitely doing better than them, and other ways it's like we're definitely doing worse than them.
Like, no, we made it worse. So the next question we have is actually one that I was going to ask you anyways. So this is perfect. What books are you currently reading or are on your TBR pile, or what books in general would you, recommend to people that you think maybe, not enough people know about? Because I always like to talk about books with people. So recommend some books, but sell some books since we're doing this a bookstore event.
Heck yeah. So an anthology that's just come out that I'm really excited about is Chromophobia. It's an all-female anthology. It's a horror anthology about color. And so they're all inspired either by the fear of color or by specific colors. It's edited by Sarah Tantlinger, and I'm very, very excited for it. So that's like the big one. And then I'm going to recommend everybody read your book, AC. Hooked is so good. It's so good. Like, I just love what you're doing with the Peter Pan story. It's so fantastic. So yeah, seriously, everybody, I mean it. Like, get AC's books. Both of them, because Wendy Darling is so beautiful too. And I love that you I remember that short story that you had come out like several years ago, the original, like it's the seed story in daily science fiction for Wendy Darling. And it was such a great story. And I was so excited when you expanded it. So I'm like, wow, that's such a cool idea. I was so excited. So I love that you've just been building on that world.
Yeah, like the best way obviously to, start a book is with a flash fiction story. Well, since I like to recommend books too, I'm going to also throw in a recommendation since we're talking a little bit about retellings. I just recently finished Silvia Moreno Garcia's The Daughter of Dr. Moreau, which, takes the classic story of Dr. Moreau, shifts the focus to a daughter and shifts the setting to Mexico. And she does a lot of really interesting stuff with it, and it's wonderful. And I think people should read it. So there we go. If we're looking for more retellings and reimaginings, that's another good one.
And that's a great example of public domain. I think that one only came into public domain in like the last 5 or 6 years. I don't think Dr. Moreau has been in public domain that long. So it's like, yay.
I've seen it. Anybody else really do a take on it. So
yeah. So I think it's recently in public domain. So yay for public domain. That book can exist now. So yay.
Yeah, I kind of love that they do every year that list of things that have just come into public domain. You can just see authors yes.
I love it. I love that The Great Gatsby recently came into public domain, and a bunch of publishers immediately started releasing things, which means they were editing them knowing it was about to go in public domain. I'm like, I love it. I love it. I'm here for all the Gatsby retellings. Let's do it.
Absolutely. Yes. The Chosen and the Beautiful. Everybody should read that one as well.
Me too. Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely beautiful. Obviously, we're both a fan of retellings.
We are.
All right. So we have another question. A great deal of classic women characters like Elizabeth Frankenstein were written as paper women. How does it feel fleshing them out and allowing them to get their revenge?
Very good, I think. I enjoy it. I love seeing stories written from perspectives that we haven't seen them from before. And so it's just a lot of fun for me to be able to be okay, who are these characters? Taking the things that we do know about them and then being able to build on that and give them a voice. I get so excited. I'm just so enthusiastic about it. So yay.
Yeah, I mean, that's to me, one of the most fun things about reimagining is this kind of taking the characters that you know less about from the classic and sort of filling in the gaps. It's almost like getting sort of a hidden history of the classic that you already know.
Yes.
Sort of Gregory Maguire did with Wicked. It kind of changes your perspective on the Wizard of Oz completely and sort of takes a character who's, she really doesn't have any, well, I mean, she does actually have some pretty valid motivation. A house got dropped on her sister. But, before that, I feel like she had the title Wicked Witch of the West. Why? What makes her so wicked? Why is she out to make flying monkeys and kill people? Even before her sister gets murdered. Yeah. Whoa.
I like that. I like that you were married. No, murdered.
No, murdered. Thinking of Gothic heroines again, apparently, and their fate's worse than death. So sort of a parallel question to that is, what do you like least about reimagining classic characters and stories?
Ooh. I don't know. I actually don't know.
If there's anything you don't like about it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I should have some kind of answer for this, but there's nothing that really comes to mind. I just really, really enjoy it. Yeah. I mean, Yeah, because I don't really feel like it's necessarily like restricting in any way, because I feel like you can do whatever you want with it. It's a good question. I don't feel like I have an answer right now, but I will think about it. Like, at the very least, I will think about that question. Thank you, because I don't know that I have anything that I can think of right off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you might run the risk of somebody being like, you ruined this for me, but I feel like that's more of a them problem than a you problem. So.
That was the thought I had, but I'm like, I feel like no matter what you write, you're going to have some people who aren't going to like it. So it's like, that's just, yeah, exactly. Like, that was something I was like, well, yeah, people might get really mad at you, but I'm like, you might have that anyways as a writer, so I can't go back.
Personally, I delight in, like, if anybody said, and nobody said this really seriously, but like, you ruined Peter Pan for me. I'm like, yes, good. He's a really creepy character. He should ruin it for you. Yeah. Here's my goal.
I love it.
So we have another excellent audience question. Would you be a reluctant immortal yourself, an enthusiastic one, or stick with remaining mortal?
I will stick with remaining mortal. Like, and if I had to be immortal, I would definitely be reluctant. It scares me, the thought of living forever. Like, life is hard. Like, it's hard to get through one lifetime, right? And like, one of the things in Reluctant Immortals is that they're dealing with the fact that they don't have a lot of money, because that's the thing I think of. Like, it would be hard to keep money going for a long time. Like, immortals and a lot of things are like, oh, they're so rich, it's no big deal. And it's like, money only lasts so long unless you're like, really good at investing. I don't know. Maybe if you're really good at investments, you're like, I could be immortal. And I'm like, I'm not good at investing. So like, immortality sounds really financially scary. I'm such a millennial. What a millennial thing to say, right? That's like what millennials say. Like, listen, I don't have the finances to be immortal. I'm sorry.
Yeah, like, the story about the vampire who's like, oh shit, now I'm stuck working forever. Like, I never get to retire because I have to fund my lifestyle. Yeah, I mean, like, not everybody's going to be a genius investor and like have tons of money. I do always sort of like the takes on immortality where they're like, no, actually, it's not as great as people think it is. Like, you have to watch all the people that you love die. And, it would just get tiring after a while, I would think. Like, I just want to rest.
Yeah. And especially like, unless you're like living in a world where it's okay to be immortal, you'd probably also have to hide it from people. So then it's like, people who are getting older and like, why is that person not getting older? Then what, are you going to have to move? Or you're going to have to like pretend, oh no, I'm so-and-so's daughter. Like, I just have to look just like them with a different.
We all just look exactly the same. Genetics are very strong in this family. This is another good question that sort of is in a similar vein, but would you rather live in the 1960s or now?
Definitely now, even though there's some things that were better than better back then than there are now. I would still prefer to be right where I am now. If nothing else, I often say like the technology, like, and the medical advances are better. Like in the 60s, like there were a lot of things that like they couldn't treat. Like I'm a little neurotic. I'm like, there's always a joke that a lot of writers are neurotic. And I'm always like, no, at least we have better, like, like treatments for things theoretically, I guess. And like, there's a little bit better technology. And I don't know, I feel like a very 21st century person at this point anyways. I'm like, even the problems we have now, I'm like, I'm ready to fight them. I'm ready. I'm built to fight these fights. This is what I'm here for.
I like that. That's like, hope for the future. Like, we don't want to go back. We want to go forward and fix what's here and now.
Yeah.
And kind of like what you're saying before, like, you wouldn't have been able to do the same kind of research that, if say the pandemic might have, who knows what it would have done to us in the 60s, but, our world was a little bit more equipped to deal with it, just in terms of like people actually be able to be connected to each other and things like that. So
absolutely.
I feel like there's enough good things about the here and now to, it's worth sticking around for.
Yeah.
Trying to see if I had any other questions that I was going to ask you, but I think we actually got through them all, and we got through all the excellent audience questions in, the perfect amount of time.
Yeah.
We have reached our unfortunate end for our reluctant mortals, or like as you said, you're like, I'm fine with being mortal, so are fine mortals.
Our perfectly content mortals. mortals.
Perfectly content. I love it.
Perfectly content mortals. We can die before we're poor.
We don't want to be stuck working for eternity.
Oh gosh, thank you so much, Gwendolyn. Thank you so much, AC. Congratulations, book birthday and everything this week.
Thank
I
you.
can't
Really
wait.
lovely. Thank you for hosting us. Thank you for
Yes.
making everything run smoothly behind the scenes. And
Yes.
Yay!
thank you everybody for attending.
Yeah. Thank you all for the awesome questions. Thank you for everybody for coming. Yay. I really appreciate it. This is wonderful.
And I'm really looking forward to that Dorian Gray book.
Yes. Now you've
you're
said
right.
it publicly
He is
out loud
not
in front of
a
an
good guy.
audience. Now you have to do it.
Yes, it did. Oh, but last question before we go: where can people find you on social media?
So you can find me at Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Just look up my name, Gwendolyn Kiste.
I have a somewhat broken website at the moment that's acwise.net, but I'm also on Twitter as AC_wise. And just to make things slightly more complicated, I'm on Instagram as A.C.wise. Because of course I couldn't keep them both the same just to make it easy for people, right?
No, of course not. Got to keep them on their toes. Got to keep them guessing. Don't forget, everyone, you can still get your own copies of Reluctant Immortals and any others of Gwendolyn's and AC's books. Just click the link below. They'll take you to our website. We have their books linked there. And before they're gone, don't wait too long. You can get signed book plates from both Gwendolyn and AC. Get a little doodle. I hope you all have a great evening or day or whatever time it is if you're watching this in the future. And I'll see you at the next event. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank
you.
you.
Bye.